We left you off with a story last time, and I gave you a homework assignment for those of you who were here. Let me just review the story for you and tell you the context where we are. Okay, we're on page 117 in the Kuzari, and what we left off with last time was Rabbi Yehuda Halevi trying to explain to us why we failed to appreciate the relatively minor offense that the golden calf really was. It's really amplified in our own minds, he says, because we failed to appreciate the allure of idolatry that existed in biblical times. And had we been there and really been part of that milieu, we would have realized that the great attraction of idolatry was sometimes so overpowering that it would have been hard for us to really disassociate ourselves from it so easily. The Rambam makes a point of this as well, and he tells us that this demand upon the Jewish people to disassociate themselves from idolatry was extremely difficult. It's almost like if I were to come to you today, and a prophet were to come to us today and was to say to us, from now on, we want you to worship God in purely non-verbal forms, meaning that you can no longer say words in your worship of the Almighty. You can have thoughts, and you can draw pictures, and you can make genuflections and gestures, but you can no longer speak to God. Now that would be extremely difficult for us. And can you imagine the great desire? I just wanted to say, no more speaking, no more talking in your worship of Hashem. And that would be very difficult. So we would sympathize with the individual who would all of a sudden, after that command, would all of a sudden find himself wanting to have a relationship with the Almighty and sort of turn and open up a siddur and start davening, even though that was the new idolatry. We would say, well, that's what worship is for most people of faith. So that's really what it was like to be a monotheistic non-idolater in the biblical world as the Jews were leaving Egypt. The demand that was being made upon Klal Yisrael was really quite disorienting, and when they had this opportunity to construct some kind of icon to represent HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at this very insecure moment when they thought that Moshe Rabbeinu was dead and they were leaderless, so this was what they resorted to. And we explained last time that the desire for idolatry was sometimes overpowering, and we illustrated that with a story from Maseches Sanhedrin. We learned that story last week. It's a very short story, and I left you with a homework assignment, which was you have to provide me your interpretation of the story. The story basically goes like this, that one of the great sages, Ashi, was having a discussion with his disciples, teaching the Gemaras of Sanhedrin and talking about the kings, the three kings that are mentioned in the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, who, because of their dastardly deeds, forfeited their portion in the world to come. And Ashi concluded the shir one day by saying, tomorrow we'll discuss our friend Menasheh, King Menasheh. So this was considered to be an affront to the honor of King Menasheh. So King Menasheh appears to Ashi in a dream that night, and he says to him, I have a simple question, a simple halachic question for you, Ashi. When it's time for you to make hamotzi, where do you break the bread from? Now this is assuming that you have a half a loaf of bread left over from yesterday's meal, and it's time for you to make hamotzi. We know that when you make hamotzi, you're supposed to break bread from the most important part of the loaf. Where do you break the bread from? Do you break the bread at the crust, or do you dig your hand into the white of the bread on the side? Ashi said, I don't know. I never learned that halacha. So Menasheh says to him, something that even children of my generation knew, such a basic halacha about how to make hamotzi, you don't know, and you have the chutzpah to call yourself my friend? So Ashi said, well, tell me the halacha, and tomorrow when I go to shir, I'll teach it in your name. So Menasheh tells him, when you make hamotzi, you have to break the crust and not the white of the bread. And as a result, that next day, when Rav Ashi started to give shir, he said, we're going to discuss now our teachers, including King Menasheh. That's the end of the story of the Gemara. Now, the Gemara also tells us that Rav Ashi asked King Menasheh, and he said to him, if you're such a wise man and you know so much Torah, then how come you committed such horrible, heinous acts of idolatry in your lifetime? How could you have done such a thing? So Menasheh tells him, he says, listen to me. If you would have been alive in my generation, you would have lifted up your hemline of your tunic and run as quickly as you could after me. You would have been first on line to bow down to the idols right there with me. That's what he tells. And the Maharal explains that the imagery of lifting up your hemline is that normally when you know you're doing something wrong, you welcome an impediment. But you would have been so anxious and without any kind of inhibition, without any reservation whatsoever, you would have run as quickly as you could to bow down to idols. So great was the overpowering Yetzer Hara for idolatry back then. So last week I left you with a homework assignment, which was, out of all of the halachas that Menasheh could have tested Rav Ashi with, why did he test him with this halacha of making hamotzi? From where in the bread are you supposed to make hamotzi from? So what was the significance of that question, and how did it relate to Rav Ashi's and Menasheh's interchange about the desire for idolatry? Anyone come up with any ideas? Yes, Patricia.
Well, the crust is the least tasty, the least attractive piece of bread. So it's the unexpected answer. And it's the answer you have to really think about. It's the hardest thing to do, not the easy thing. The easy thing is to pull out the sauce. The crust is the hard thing to do.
Good.
And you just said that the strength of the Yetzer Hara in those times. So teacher is somewhat ironic, because what King Menasheh is teaching is that no matter how much halacha you know, the hardest thing to do is to stand up against the Yetzer Hara.
Good, very nice, lovely interpretation. Very good, good. Anyone else? See, we have to try and draw this out. This is Talmudic interpretation, especially of homily. It's very healthy to try and think about these things. Anytime Chazal give you a story or they give you a mashal, there's a tremendous precision in every single detail of what they provide. So if they tell you a story with this particular halacha, as you see, Patricia was able to draw a very important lesson. There are a number of different ways of interpreting it. There's a lot of discussion about this particular story in the Gemara. Think about for a moment about the idea of a loaf of bread baking in the oven. The heat source is the light, is the fire. And metaphorically, that could represent a spiritual source. A lot of times, as Patricia said, the thing that it gets closest to the source sometimes is the most unsavory. But it also acts as a protective crust, a protective covering for the more desirable and the softer parts of the bread. And perhaps what King Menasheh was saying to Rav Ashi is that fact that you don't have a Yetzer Hara for idolatry is that because you're like the white of the bread, you're the softer, weaker part of the bread because you're further away from that source of spirituality. You see, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, so the closer you are, the more spiritually attuned that you are, the more risk there is for great failure in spiritual endeavors. Just like the crust of the bread is closest to the flame, is closest to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and yet it's those very people that sometimes have the greatest Yetzer Hara. We know the principle that Chazal tell us, called Hagadol Mechavero Yitzra Gadol Himenu, that whoever is greater than his fellow has a greater Yetzer Hara than his fellow. The fact of the matter is that people were so spiritually minded and had a certain world view of the universe that was completely, there was very little separation between the physical and spiritual realms in people's minds in the ancient world, And as a result, idolatry became a real phenomenon for them because they didn't have that solid distinction that you and I have between the physical and the spiritual realms. So it's very logical to take something as part of the physical world and use it as a spiritual tool. Whereas today for us, we think so concretely and we're able to compartmentalize things in a way that was not done in the ancient world. And that's what Menasheh was trying to point out to him. It's your very weakness that makes you not have a Yetzer Hara for idolatry. So therefore you can't fathom the challenges that I've had to face. Right? You've never walked a mile in my moccasins. Okay, so I think that's really what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is trying to impart to us, that we can't presume to judge the generation that left Egypt. We were not slaves our entire lives. We were not exposed to the Egyptian culture that they were. As a matter of fact, there's another very curious midrash, which depicts Moshe Rabbeinu as placing the blame directly at God's feet for the sin of the golden calf. He says, Hashem, it's your fault. It's not the Jewish people's fault. And he gives him a very curious mashal. He says, let's say you have a father who raises his beloved only son and pampers him and gives him everything his heart desires. And then one day for his 18th birthday, he takes a pouch of money, ties it around his son's neck, and places him in a red light district downtown somewhere and says, have a nice day, right? If the son goes ahead and becomes corrupted, who's to blame for that? Is it the father or is it the son to blame for the son becoming corrupted? And the Medrash says, of course it's the father's fault, because he placed all of these temptations in front of his son without any restrictions. So Moshe Rabbeinu turns to Hashem and he says, you put us in Egypt. You put us in a place of great depravity and impurity, a place of great idolatry. What were you expecting from the Jewish people? How could you expect them not to be influenced negatively by the cultural milieu, the society in which you placed them? What do you want from us? And it was that argument that, at least according to the Medrash, which is the thing that finally convinced Hashem to forgive the Jewish people. Salachti kidvarecha, I forgive Klal Yisrael as you have said, Moshe, as you have requested, Moshe. So, okay, so that's where we're up to, and therefore, and then the last thing that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi said in this paragraph on page 117 is that, even today we have vestiges of things that are very similar to idolatry that we think nothing of. I mean, the Torah tells us to build cherubim on top of the ark cover, and they have faces of little children, and that's supposed to represent a place where God comes down into the world, and we don't think anything about it. It's not idolatrous for us. Look at the representations and illustrations that we place in the synagogue. We put the two lions on the parochis of the Aron Kodesh. That's not idolatry for us because we know that it's an artwork and it's not God himself. We're not bowing down to God when we daven Shmona Esrei in front of the two lions on the Aron Kodesh. We understand it's a representation of Kedusha, that we assign a certain higher level of Kedusha to the synagogue than we assign to our own homes. Yeah?
Sorry to drive this out, but the question popped into my mind. Why then was Menasheh denied his portion in the world to come rather than being forgiven if he was tested to such an extreme point?
Well, the answer is that at the end of the day he still had free will. And it was still considered to be sinful. It was even worse than that, is that Menasheh succumbed to his temptations, and he also had the free will to spare the rest of the Jewish people of his own demons. But he went ahead and said, it's not just enough that I'm going to worship idols, I have to make sure that the rest of the Jewish people also do. And that's why the Gemara describes him as having taken Torah scrolls, cutting out God's name from the Torah scrolls and replacing them with names of idolatry. Essentially what he was doing was to try to hybridize Judaism with idolatry and make it palatable for the rest of the Jewish people. So that's why he's criticized so strongly, and he loses his share in the world to come, because a person, it's one thing for you to sin for yourself, but if you're machtias harabim, if you cause other people to sin, so then you lose your share in the world to come. Okay? Yes?
With regard to the last comment, last commentary, with regard to the symbols in the shul, isn't the golden calf was very different, because they attributed to the people said this is our God who took us out of Egypt, so they attributed a lot more power to this.
They attributed power to that, but of course, they weren't foolish. They knew that a golden image that they had just constructed after leaving Egypt was not the being that took them out of Egypt. So when they say, this is your God, O Israel, who took you out of Egypt, this is the physical representation of what God is in heaven who took us out of Egypt. They understood that. They weren't foolish people. They just were attracted to this idea of creating physical representations of a higher power, of a deity. Right? They wanted to focus their attention on something physical that would remind them or that would associate them with Hashem. That's what they meant. Okay? So let's go now on to page 118, and we continue along with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's minimization of the crime. And we're on subparagraph 11. Just need someone to read for today, a volunteer. Someone just spelled it out. Go ahead.
Despite this, those who worshipped the golden calf were punished and executed. The number executed was only around 3,000 out of 600,000 adult males.
That's 0.5% of the male population, which suffered as a result. So when you put it in that perspective, this is the number that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi comes up with, because this is the number that's discussed in the Torah. That it says that when Moshe Rabbeinu said, Mi Lashem Elai, when Moshe comes down, he breaks the tablets and he says to whoever for God should come to me, and we got to clean up this mess. So the family of Levi comes to Moshe, and he tells them, take your swords and kill anyone who persists in their worship of the golden calf. And it says that they killed 3,000 people. Now, the number may be somewhat different. It's not clear, because the Torah also tells us that there was a plague at the same time, and we're told that Moshe ground up the golden calf into gold dust, mixed it with water, and forced people to drink. And those who were very much involved in it drank from it and died. It was like the water of the sota, like sota water. So that is not taken into account in this number 3,000. I don't know what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi does with that additional amount. But he's trying to tell us that the only number that we have of casualties is 3,000. That's itemized by the Torah. So he says that that's not a lot of people when you take into account the huge number of people that left Egypt. Go ahead, please.
During this whole debacle, the sustaining manna never stopped falling, nor did the protective clouds dissipate, nor did the pillar of fire stop leading the way. Prophecy still abounded and even increased during this time. They were deprived of nothing that had been given to them except for the original 2 tablets which Moshe broke. He later prayed to have another set of tablets given to them, and this wish was fulfilled. Their sin was pardoned.
Right. And here again, what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is doing is he's telling us that it wasn't as bad as we think it was. I want to quote for you a pasuk in Nehemiah. I'm just bringing it up on my handy-dandy handheld Tanakh, which I just bring up very easily. And the psukim in Nehemiah state as follows. Nehemiah is talking about the sin of the golden calf to the Jewish people who are coming back to Eretz Yisrael. And he says to them as follows, Af ki asu lahem egel masecha, that even when the Jewish people built for themselves a golden calf, vayomru ze Elohecha asher he'elcha mitzrayim, vayasu ne'atzos gedolos, and they said, this is your God who took you out of Egypt, and they performed many breaches or abominations. But you, God, you never forsook the Jewish people in the desert. Es ha'amud he'anan, this is from, as your footnote says, from Nehemiah chapter 9. Es amud he'anan lo sar me'alehem b'yomam lahanchosam behaderech. The cloud pillar never departed from them during the daytime to lead them on the way. Ve'esamud ha'ish b'layla laha'ir lahem, and nor did the fire pillar forsake them at night. Ve'saderech asher yelchu bo, always showing them the path to go. Ve'ruchacha ha'tova nasata lahaschilam, and not only that, and this is where Yehuda Levi gets this idea, your great spirit you gave them to give them even more understanding. Umancha lo manata mipihem, and you did not take away their manna. Umayim nasat lahem litzma'am, and you gave them water to quench their thirst. So if the sin of the golden calf was so great, how could HaKadosh Baruch Hu have continued to sustain them with the man and the cloud pillar and the fire pillar? Hashem didn't depart from their midst. When was the last time you had man? Huh? You think you're so great? When was the last time you had man? Right? So that should be a sign of the fact that the Jewish people's crime was not as great as we attribute it to them. You know, we say this, Chazal tell us this message, that the truth of the matter is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is an extremely forbearing God. Because when you think about it, the very organs that God sustains every single moment of your life, the very fact that He sustains your beating heart and your breathing lungs, and that every part of your body is working, He's doing that while you're rebelling against Him. While you're speaking Lashon Hara, God's allowing your tongue to work. While you're walking to do an Aveira, God's allowing your legs to function. While you're thinking about sin, God is allowing your brain waves and your heart to continue beating. God sustains those even when the individual is doing something that is against Hashem. So that's a sign that God is extremely forbearing. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's message is, and there's something that we have to think about, is that we're using the very tools that Hashem gave us as a gift against Him. That's only amplifies the nature of the sin. Every time we think, if you think about that, every time you're about to do something, like how treacherous it is to use God's gifts against Him, then that might be a greater disincentive. But what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is saying is that, look, Hashem was with the Jewish people this whole time, and the Shekhinah was among them, despite the fact that all of these terrible things happened. There was still Nevuah. There were Nevi'im, not Moshe Rabbeinu was not the only Navi. They were deprived of nothing. Even after Moshe broke the Luchos, he was able to get a reprieve, and they got a new set of Luchos. So how bad could the Egel HaZahav have been? Now, the truth of the matter is that Rabbi Yehuda Levi is not going to tell us the whole story here, because Chazal do portray that there were permanent after effects of the Chet HaEgel. And the pasuk says, "Uviyom pakdi ufokarati alayhem chatosam." At any time, Hashem says that I punish the Jewish people, there will be some admixture of punishment for the sin of the golden calf within every future punishment that the Jewish people have to sustain. Now, what this means essentially is that we were essentially transformed after the sin of the golden calf because we fell from a very, very high pedestal because of this sin. But Rabbi Yehuda Levi is not going to use that portrayal here, because runs counter to the whole argument that he's trying to make. What was the whole objective here? He's trying to explain to us that despite sometimes where you see Jews not living up to the expectations that are placed upon them, we're still the chosen people. We're still a holy people. We're still a people which has an infinite kind of value within us that is innate and that is not revocable. It can never be taken away from us. And remember, this is again how he's using the golden calf to explain how the innate specialness of the Jewish people can never be lost, despite the fact that the king had suggested, how can you ascribe any specialness to the Jewish people after their treachery of the golden calf? Rabbi Yehuda Levi says, we didn't essentially change. God didn't remove our chosenness from us when we've sinned against Him, even when we worship the golden calf. That specialness always remains. And then again, as part of the polemic against Christianity and other religions who feel that there's been some kind of supersessionism, that there's been some kind of exchange that we lost when we didn't do something that we were supposed to do, or we sinned in a certain treacherous way, we lost our chosen status. That's not the case. If we didn't lose our chosenness after the golden calf, then we certainly didn't lose our chosenness for rejecting some fellow who claimed to be the Messiah and the Son of God. So that's the subliminal subtext of this whole discussion. There's another subtext of this whole discussion, which is what you're going to discover in the very next paragraph. Very next paragraph, which is paragraph 98, leads after this whole discussion of the golden calf, which was, ostensibly when we first learned about the golden calf. Go back to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's introduction to the story of the golden calf, all the way back on page 111. If you go back to page 111, paragraph 96, what was the reason why the Khazar king had raised the issue of the golden calf to begin with? Because he said, I grant you they inherited their greatness from Adam, this innate, inherent specialness that makes them higher than other human beings. We received some kind of genetic traits that are irrevocable. He says, but still, how could there be any remnant of greatness after the sin of the golden calf? That was how we got into this whole discussion to begin with, because Rabbi Yehuda Halevi emphasizes the special nature of the Jewish people. But now, as you're going to see, the Khazar king is taking a different lesson, or an additional lesson from the story of the golden calf, and that's what we see in paragraph 98. Please read that, Elisa, and then this will be what we finish with in the Kuzari for today.
The Kuzari said, "You have already helped confirm my conviction in my thoughts and my vision and the visions in my dreams that one cannot achieve divinity without divine decree, that is, without those actions which God commands one to perform. Were this not the case, then most people who attempted to achieve divinity would succeed, including the seers, occultists, fire worshippers, sun worshippers, and dualists."
All right, so now what is the connection here? If the Khazar king was merely interested in trying to get some justification for the chosenness of the Jewish people even after the golden calf, I would have expected in paragraph 98, so if the Khazar's king is going to sort of respond to this whole argument, he should have said, I now understand how the Jewish people could retain their chosenness even after worshiping a golden calf. But that's not what he says. He says something totally different. You've now helped confirm my conviction in my thoughts and the visions in my dreams that the only way to achieve divinity, which means the closeness with Hashem, some kind of connection to God, it can only be done by divine decree. Which means what? The mitzvahs themselves. In other words, you have to follow the mitzvahs of Hashem in order to achieve closeness with Hashem. It cannot be done through one's own mental, rationalizations or extrapolations. It can only be done through following the mitzvahs of the Torah. What does that have to do with the golden calf?
Well,
yes.
Presumably, they thought that it was achieving a closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Right. They thought that they could bypass the system. They thought that whatever they needed to do in order to achieve that closeness, they were going to do. So even though Hashem said, "Thou shalt not have any graven images before me," they said, okay, we understand that's a commandment. But the bigger picture is we've got to be close to God. So if we have to, sort of ignore one of the commandments of Hashem to accomplish the greater good of closeness with Hashem, then it's certainly justifiable. That's the second message, or the second subtext of the whole reason why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi brings in the story of the golden calf. And it goes back to that mashal that we've mentioned several times, that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself mentions a few times in the Kuzari, about the fellow who discovers the medical, the clinic, the medicine cabinet. Yes?
This is kind of harkening back to the original comment, I think, to the Kuzari king. Wasn't the comment that your intentions are good, but your actions are
Bingo. Very good. Excellent. You see, so you're seeing that this is all tying together to the original dream. The original dream that the angel tells the Khazar king is, your intentions are good, but not your deeds. Is that exactly? This is the whole theme that runs through and unifies all of Sefer HaKuzari. That it's not based, you cannot come to an understanding of the true worship of Hashem by using your own mental conclusions, by using your own intellect to come to those conclusions. No matter how well-intentioned you are, well-thought you are, you have to follow a set of commandments that are imposed upon you by Hashem, whether they make sense to you or not. Yeah.
what you said before about Hashem's forbearance and not punishing us when we're going to do a sin, if he would, we would have no bechira. If someone was walking to say Lashon Hara and his legs caved in under him, that would be the last person to ever say Lashon Hara.
Right.
So to me, that argument doesn't really resonate.
Okay, I mean, it's not so much that that you have to accept that God could have done it another way. It's sort of to bring home to you of, this is really bad what I'm doing. I'm really doing something bad. God gave me a heart to keep me alive, and I'm using it for the wrong things. I'm using it to do exactly precisely the opposite of why he gave me this precious gift. I have a functioning body, and I'm using it for improper purposes. That's the point that we're trying to make. Yeah.
I was just wondering if another potential interpretation of this would be that divine decree doesn't necessarily mean mitzvot or commandment. That divine decree can also be achieved via a test, in a sense. So if God's testing you with something specifically, like Avodah Zarah that's put in front of you, that you can achieve that divinity, you can achieve that closeness to God through that process.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I would agree that a lot of times we get messages from Hashem in life, and that's also part of the divine decree. I'm just looking at the Hebrew just to make sure that I'm Ela bidavar Eloki, b'ma'asim sheyitzavim ha'elokim. He says here in the Hebrew, it's through the behaviors that God commands us to do. But it could be that subsumed onto that is also what you're suggesting, that we get messages from Hashem in life. Yeah, okay. All right, we'll hold it here for today. And then we'll continue along this subject next time of how to achieve divinity.